Hi everybody, welcome. This is Super Fast Najdorf Part 3, and of course, super fast is becoming increasingly ironic. I was hoping to compress all this material very quickly. I knew, of course, that it was basically impossible to do so with any with any degree of, certainly no comprehensiveness, but even semi-responsibly. But it turns out that even trying to go through this at a very fast, somewhat irresponsible rate, it's still proving quite difficult. So, in fact, this is still just going to be the penultimate show. So we're going to cover some of the bishop to g5 complex, but several important moves after that will have to wait their turn for another show. Okay, so here he goes. This is, again, the Najdorf. It's the Sicilian, so let's start from move 1 here. e4, c5, knight f3, d6. Here, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. Okay, so that's what makes it a Najdorf, bishop g5. So this is the grand poobah of all Najdorfs, the granddaddy of them all. The tutti capo, I think, is the term. Since it's a Sicilian, we should use this term from family language, mafia language. At any rate, whatever you want to call it, this is it. This is the most complex of all of the systems within the Najdorf. And I say the system, the most complex system, but really this is just the beginning. Now black has a bunch of options. Okay, here not too many, but very quickly. Notice a couple of points. First of all, it used to be that people played the dragon in this move order or a move order like it, but g6 doesn't really make much sense here, as white is simply going to rip off the knight on f6, at least if he wants to. Could maybe even play queen to d2. This probably isn't so bad either. And he's ready to go on bishop to g7 with bishop to h6. Okay. And I guess castles have been played once here too. But anyway, white's in good shape. So the dragon really isn't appropriate in this move order after bishop to g5. Also, black could play knight to c6. Again, this kind of invites bishop takes f6. But it's playable, but it's basically turning it into a classical Sicilian and then the Rouser variation. So white can consider taking on f6 or just play queen to d2. Either way, we are basically switching into another system, so we won't really discuss that. A move that is a Najdorf move, but fairly rare, is knight b to d7. And the reason why this is rare is that it lets white get both bishops to their best posts. So white plays bishop to c4, queen a5, queen d2, e6, let's say bishop to b3 here, long castles, and rook h to e1. And I guess the theoretical reputation of this at the moment is probably that it's tenable for black, but white's score here is pretty good. I think there was a famous Spassky-Petrosian game from the 1969 World Championship match, the second time they played, when Spassky won, and Spassky demolished Petrosian from here. Now, it doesn't mean that this is just winning at this point, but it's just a dangerous system. Also, and maybe this is what I'm thinking of, there's also an old Tal Pologievsky game, I think from the Soviet Championship back in maybe 56, where Tal succeeded in defeating an opponent who would prove to be a real problem for him later on in their careers. But in this game, Tal with white won fairly handily. Okay, so the main move here isn't knight b to d7. It might be playable, but as I said, it's relatively unpopular, and I explained why. And probably at best, it's just of transpositional value. So the main move, overwhelmingly, is e6. And now here, white has played queen f3 in the past, the idea of bringing the queen to g3 and only then considering f4, and also trying to castle quickly. This is playable, but black seems to be okay. It's not that popular nowadays. So something like this is fairly typical. And here black makes a maneuver that's quite common in the bishop to g5 Najdorf. So he plays h6, and then g5. And the idea of this, this doesn't quite work in the usual way, entirely in the usual way, but some strong similarities. And one of the points is essentially to break off this f4 pawn, so it can't play f5, and it can't support e5 any longer. So those options are foreclosed. And furthermore, after this f pawn leaves, it goes to g5. Black gets this really strong square on e5 for his knight. So let's see how this works. So f takes g5, and now, well, one way it's the game or the variation continues with knight to h5, queen e3, queen c5. And there's this pin, and this is again part and parcel of this kind of approach with g5, h6 and g5. So king b1 takes, bishop f2, knight e5. All right, and knight f3. And okay, this is actually a pretty playable position for black. Probably he's going to want to castle queenside, so it's black doesn't play like this when he's already castled kingside. But if he hasn't castled kingside and castling queenside, or even at least keeping his king in the center safely is possible, then this approach can be used. Okay, well, oh, also one other line. After f takes g5, instead of knight to h5, black can also play rook to g8. And at some point, things are going to give. And actually here, black is sacrificing a pawn, but the pin on the g file is kind of awkward. The bishop on h4 is a little bit funny looking, and black still has his strong knight on e5 in any case. All right. So I don't really want to say too much about queen f3. So let's go on to the main move here. F4. Oh, one other thing I should mention is the queen of d2 is not really so good. So unlike in the classical, I believe black can play here h6, and if bishop to h4, black has knight takes e4. And there, I think, are some specific reasons why this works here, but it doesn't work in the classical. And the basic reason is this: that when this pawn is here and the knight's here, white can play knight takes e4. First knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight takes e4, queen takes h4, and then knight takes d6 check. So the point is that with the knight on c6, white can clear the d file to do that. And so this becomes a less attractive possibility for black. Whereas here, it's okay for him. So that's one reason why white plays f4 and queen to f3 rather than queen to d2. Okay, now here black has a ton of moves. In fact, we will look at all of them, I think, at this point, but or all of the main moves. All right, now one move that's a little bit unusual, but was recommended by Tony Costin in his book on the Najdorf a few years ago, is knight to c6. Now, again, this looks like black is just kind of mixing up his systems here and trying to get back into a classical, but there are some differences. I mean, white has some options that are new and interesting. And this move may be playable. It's certainly provocative, but I don't think there's any clear refutation of it. I'll show you one interesting variation. So takes. This is the most principled move approach for white. e5. Okay, and now, of course, not d takes e5. That gives white a very good game. But h6, and again, g5. All right, so f takes g5. And now there's no knight to g4 anymore, but you can play knight to d5. All right, so this is okay. Again, exploiting the pin and hoping to win the g pawn back. All right, so here white plays knight to e4, protecting the pawn, and of course aiming at d6. So you can see maybe c4 followed by either taking on d6 or, even better, playing knight to f6 check is a real threat for black to be concerned about. So queen to b6, bishop d3, hg, bishop g5. And now here we have an interesting position. And see if you can figure out what black to move ought to do here. Good place to stop the recording and get in a little tactics practice. All right, last chance. If you said rook takes h2, you have a good tactical eye, but you need to have a little more self-discipline in your tactical imagination. So it works in the simplest sense, but there's a big problem with it. So again, you might want to stop the recording and see if you can find it. Here's the answer. White takes, queen g1, and now bishop f1. Very important move. And the point is that after queen takes h2, queen takes d5, and black is dead lost. Because if he doesn't capture the queen, he's just down a piece for nothing. There's nothing from him to counterattack or to also attack. And also he has to worry about queen takes c6 check. So he takes, but then knight f6 check, king wherever, knight to g4 check, and white recaptures the queen and ends up a piece ahead. So that's a losing move. Rook takes h2, that is. And, oops, too far. And so black has to play something else. But it looks like something else is okay. Queen takes b2. And now here, if c4, black has another neat tactical idea. Actually, he could play queen takes e5, because if c takes d5, he recaptures on d5, and then the knight on e4 is dropping. Or he could even play bishop to e7. And the nifty idea here, okay, so again, if c takes d5, bishop g5, and queen e5 check is good. And if bishop takes e7, knight e3 basically forces an immediate draw. Queen c1, knight g2, and then knight to e3 check, and so on, because queen takes e3 allows queen takes a1 check. So this is a drawing variation. So you and your friends, if you want to play a real game, you can use this and call it a day very quickly. All right, so knight c6 is possible. It's playable. It's not the most popular move, but while it's provocative and dangerous, it also doesn't seem to be refuted just yet. We'll see what happens if someone plays this against Anand or Topalov, but for the moment at least, it survives. Okay, next, consider the move h6. And one of the ideas here is to, again, force the white bishop back, but at a convenient moment before white can ignore this threat, and also to prepare this g5 trick. So, for example, bishop h4, bishop e7, queen f3, queen c7. All right, so all of this is a lot like the absolute main line, which we'll cover in our final episode on the super fast Najdorf, but with h6 and bishop to h4 thrown in. And the difference is that, okay, after bishop to d3, black again uses this g5 trick. So fg, knight e5. Important to throw that in so we can play knight f to g4 next. And again, black is going to regain the pawn on account of this pin here. So knight f3, takes, and now the knight doesn't have to move, but h takes g5 first. So bishop g3, knight e5. Now let's say f4, takes, bishop to d7. And here, a good move for white is rook d to f1, trying to make it a little bit more difficult for black to castle, because if he castles, then bishop takes e5. So demonstrate this. Takes, and rook f7. And it doesn't really seem that black has full compensation. So he's got the bishop here, but white should be better. So black could also play knight takes d3, but then he's giving up this great knight for a bishop that really isn't all that great. So the best move here is rook to h7. So a little prophylactic move, protecting the f7 pawn in advance, and then after, let's say, h4, now black is ready to castle, and it's a playable position for both sides. All right, so now we've talked about h6, and we've discussed briefly knight to c6. Now we're going to come to two theoretical monsters, the Polygievsky variation with b5, and the so-called poison pawn variation with queen to b6. So it's this was, I don't know if it was invented by Bronstein, but he played it a long time ago, and of course Fischer was the greatest popularizer of the variation. Kasparov played this too. In fact, I think Karpov even played it once against Miguel Quinteros, and I believe he won that game. But this isn't exactly typical Karpov, even when he was in his heyday. All right, at any rate, here, after f4, we're going to start with b5, the Polygievsky variation. And if you look at Polygievsky's book on this, again, I think it's called Grandmaster Preparation, or at least that's what it used to be called. That was the original version. Nowadays it's called, hang on a second. Right, Grandmaster Achievement. So I had to go look on my shelf real quick. Great book. I mean, it's like a love story about a man and his pet variation. So he talks about the trials and tribulations that he would, come up against all of these really powerful attacking ideas, and sometimes he would kind of give up and put it on the shelf, and other times he would really work and find these brilliant resources, and somehow always find a way to keep this variation alive. For those of you who don't know who Polygievsky is, Lev Polygievsky is a super strong Soviet GM. I mentioned him a few minutes ago. From Ukraine, died in, I think, 1994. A bit young, like 58 or so, of I believe it was a brain tumor. Maybe he was 60 at that point. So he was born in the mid-30s. In the late through the 70s really, and even into the 80s. He's one of the world's strongest grandmasters. Probably about a top 5 guy at his absolute peak. a player who gave Mikhail Tal a terrible time because he was just such a great calculator. And seems to just have been a nice, ordinary guy, and also not one of these people with this real bloodlust. And perhaps that hurt him a bit as a chess player, but made him, I'm sure, a better person. At any rate, b5 is his brainchild, his baby, and he did more than anyone else by far to keep this variation alive. Now, the idea is very logical. I mean, b5 is a very typical move in the Najdorf. It prepares bishop to b7. It has the idea in some cases of playing b4 to really undermine this pawn on e4. Well, what's the drawback? Well, the drawback is, of course, that white can play e5. Now, if white doesn't play e5, he's just got nothing. I mean, he's going to end up in, at best, an equal position and one that has reasonable chances for becoming worse. So e5 is the only testing move. Okay, so d, e, f, e. And now not h6 and g5, but queen to c7. So this is the first basic tactical idea in this opening. So the point is that after e takes f6, queen e5 check, and white is going to lose his extra piece. So either the bishop, or he can play knight to e4. Also, white can sometimes play queen to e2. And we'll start with this move. I think this was Bronstein, I believe, was an advocate of this move, and I think Nezhmetinov, the famous crazy tactician, also was a fan of this try as well. Okay, so knight f to d7, castles, and now here probably the safest way to go is with knight c6, takes and takes, and just getting rid of some dangerous white pieces. See, the thing is, in this opening, I mean, white has a big leading development, has some extra space, but black's bishops are going to be tremendous, and the e5 pawn is also often going to fall. So white more or less needs to get his initiative working full blast, or he'll just end up with a poor position in the long run. All right, so knight c6 is probably best, but bishop to b7 has been played too, but very, very risky. So here, for instance, white plays queen to g4, already threatening knight takes e6, which is just going to be winning practically on the spot. I mean, there are various tricks too, where knight e6, queen e5, and then all white needs to do is move the queen, so there's knight to c7 mate. All right, so let's look at some variations here. So, for instance, queen takes e5. This has actually been played on a number of occasions. Now, this looks suicidal. I mean, you might think, okay, just bishop b5, rook h to e1, and black has got to be dead here. I mean, how in the world is black going to survive this? I mean, the queen moves, we play knight takes e6, queen e6, and we just mate him on e7. I mean, how does black survive this? So, see if you can figure it out. How does black manage to stay alive here? Well, the answer, and it's one that comes up in quite a few Polygievsky variations, is by pushing the h-pawn of all things, h5. So the point is, okay, first of all, rook takes e5 does nothing. Queen to h3 would allow queen takes g5 check, and then there's no longer going to be a mate on e7, or d8 for that matter. So queen to h4, but now e6 is under attack. So let's say queen to c5, queen g3, bishop c6, and I believe in this position black is at least surviving for the moment. So instead of bishop takes b5, bishop to e2 is another try, a little bit more patient, but still very dangerous. White wants to play things like rook h to e1 and bishop to f3, and black could still get killed very easily here. Okay, so bishop to c5, bishop c4, queen f6, and it's not clear if white has anything better than just repeating. So it's a scary line, and there are more scary lines, but it looks like in a lot of them, black always has some little tiny resource to stay alive. Okay, instead of queen takes e5, another variation is queen to b6, protecting the e6 pawn. And notice all the times that black has already moved the queen. So it went to c7. Okay, actually here it didn't move too many times, so it just went to c7 and then to b6. But you'll see other variations where the queen moves like 5, 6, 7 times, and black still somehow manages to come out alive. All right, so here, bishop to e2, again, a little bit more patient approach, but trying to bring out the pieces quickly. Knight takes e5, queen h3, knight b to d7, rook h to e1. So white's ready to go. He's all lined up. Maybe he's going to play bishop to h5, threatening to have a little explosion on e6. But looks like black can survive with something like this. h6, g6, so we take over h5, and we're going to play bishop to g7 and castle, if allowed. So bishop to g4, h5, bishop e6, breakthrough? Probably not. Check. By the way, this is another little motif. There are an awful lot of variations in the Poligevsky where black has some little check somewhere that buys him just enough time to get out of whatever immediate danger he's in. So king b1 takes, knight e6, and now black can play either king f7 or rook h7, and I don't know what's going on here, but presumably black is okay. All right, so let's go back to this position after queen to c7 and look at the main move. E takes f6. Okay, so black has to play queen e5 check. And now, again, knight e4 has been played. I don't really want to say much about this. Okay, of course, black has to take. And now knight to e2 is the main move. All right, so now there are not very well disguised threats against the d8 square. Obviously, f takes g7, followed by queen d8 mate, or queen to d8 check, and then f takes g7 and g takes h8. So black will either play knight to d7 or knight to c6 here. Let's say white plays queen to d2, preparing to castle, and still cause some trouble. And so here black can either play h6 and try to break up this the bishop's control over the d8 square, or another typical idea in the Poligevsky, rook to a7, with the idea of swinging the rook over to d7. So, for example, castles, rook to d7, here knight to c3 is an important move, then queen to e5, bishop d3, g takes f6. Looks greedy, but really it's just that he needs to get rid of that pawn. So bishop to f4, queen d4, bishop e3, queen e5, and you know what this is going to be. Draw by repetition. All right, so fascinating line. And as I said, also knight to d7 instead of knight to c6 is playable. Okay, well that's all I wanted to say about knight to e4, so let's get to the main line, bishop to e2. Okay, black takes, and now here again there's some choices. So notice, okay, so black has no pieces out except for the queen, which has gone from d8 to c7 to e5 to g5, and it's going to have to move at least once or twice more. Meanwhile, white has 3 pieces out. He's not down any material just yet. He's ready to castle. The d file is open. The bishop can go to f3, and it looks like white should be in fantastic shape. But it's really not so clear. All right, let's take a look at, let's see what disasters can befall black, though, if he's not careful. So one variation is to just castle here. And again, notice, though, I mean, there are always these little resources. So if, for example, something like g takes f6, knight to e4, there's queen to e3 check. So looks like it's okay. I mean, black has a resource. Though, in fact, after king to h1, this kind of boomerangs, because if queen takes e4, then bishop to f3 and bishop to a8. So bishop to e7 is probably the move here. Knight takes f6, takes, and since white has managed to regain the pawn, this really isn't so good for black. So there is that trick I wanted to point out with queen e3 check, but it's not ultimately the best idea. Okay, another move, which looks just absurd, is queen to e5. So we're not taking the pawn, we're just moving the queen back yet again. So now queen d8, c7, e5, g5, e5, and after knight f3, it's time for it to move again. Now, in a game between Patrick Wolf and Leon Pleister, black played queen takes f6, and the queen is going to move some more times, but this game doesn't last very long. So knight e4, knight f to g5, queen e3, okay, rook a7. So black brings out a second piece. It's this rook going to a7, where it protects f7. All right, Wolf played bishop to h5, g6. Of course, this stops the threat to f7, but now knight f6 check is quite pleasant. And after the forced king to e7, knight d5 check, and rook e1 wins the queen, and Pleister resigned here. So this is the kind of thing that can happen to you in the Poligevsky variation. You got to know what you're doing. You got to be able to calculate well, or you're going to be in the autopsy room fairly quickly. However, instead of queen takes f6, other queen moves turn out to be pretty good. Queen e3 check in particular. So here, knight to d7, fighting for the f6 square and blocking the d file. Let's say rook to e1, threatening bishop takes b5. So now queen to b6. So yet another queen move. Takes, takes. Okay, and now if knight to e4, threatening to drop the knight on d6, well, suddenly black can castle. And the thing is, okay, we're kind of making fun of the queen moving around and around and around, but black's pieces are all, it's not too hard for him to bring most of them out fairly quickly. And because white doesn't have this dark squared bishop anymore, it's pretty hard for him to or a lot of his attacking prospects go away, especially with the rook on the e file now, so there's no threats on the f file. The bishop on e2 isn't well placed. The knight on e4 looks nice, but, where's it going? And so black is basically okay. He's got two very good bishops. Well, one bishop is very good right now. The other one will very shortly get to b7. And life is good. So this continued c3. And now bishop to b7. So queen takes d7, bishop takes e4. It's no problem. After queen c2, rook a to d8. Here. Now h6, keeping knights off of g5. And black is becoming better here. So he's finished his development. His development is quite harmonious. White has no way of creating threats. And I think black's bishops are more important, and especially the dark square control that he will very likely achieve. All right. So instead of knight to e4, knight to g5 is a more aggressive approach, eyeing e6 and f7. So knight f6 covers at least e6 and also h7. Queen d3, bishop b7, rook f1, rook to d8, queen g3, rook to g8. And this position is about equal. Black's king obviously would prefer not to be in the center. If we could maybe spirit it off to a7 by some kind of bug house-like means, then that might be good, except for the f7 pawn hanging. But the e6 pawn is at least sufficiently guarded at the moment, so that at least right now there's not going to be any big explosion on that point or on f7. And meanwhile, white has to be a little bit careful too. I mean, this bishop on b7 is excuse me, on a fantastic diagonal, and there's not so many obstacles on the g file that this rook on g8 won't have its chances too. So the position is about equal here. Okay, so that's a little bit on castles queen e5. The main move here is rook to a7, and okay, we know the idea of this already. It's covering f7, but also preparing to block the d file with rook to d7. So queen d3, rook d7. The idea of queen d3. So this is another very typical move in the Pologievsky. It covers the e3 square, so there's no queen e3 check business, which is important, especially if white wants to play knight to e4. And of course, it also clears d1 for a rook. So rook to d7, knight e4, queen to e5. So queen keeps moving around, but it's got a threat. All right, so here, if white plays c3, then bishop to b7. And now taking on e4, and then taking on f6. And it's not really clear that white has full compensation for the pawn. Black's king is safe enough. That central pawn mass is actually pretty reasonable for defensive purposes. And the bishop is going to come to c5. And okay, it's still pretty unclear, but black certainly has his chances here. So in this position, the main move is kind of an ironic one. Knight f3. So you would think that white wouldn't want to exchange queens in a position where he's trying to attack, but in fact, the queen exchange is bad for black. So the best move here is the greedy queen takes b2, queen e3, bishop b7, a4, queen b4, and now I'm following an analysis by Richard Palliser, and I don't recall where his analysis starts and the game that he was diverging from ends, but okay, the variation in its entirety, at least we can attribute to Palliser. Okay, so bishop takes, queen c5 check, b4, so keeping lines closed on the queen side, bishop to d6, and let's say a position like this. It's kind of, it's pretty unclear. Black is ready to play something like queen to g6 to win the g pawn and to get off the f file and evict white's queen before it does anything too nasty. And on a move like knight to h4, I think black will just play queen to e5, hitting the bishop and threatening queen takes h2 mate. So no real big deal there. So this position is pretty unclear, and but it seems like black is okay. And material is even as well, so no problems there for black's point of view. I mean, especially since the G pawn is probably going to be a goner. But the pawn doesn't really matter in a position like this. I mean, clearly it's going to be about king safety and that kind of feature. All right, so that is all I wanted to say about going back, the move castles here. So castling is a main line. Another main line, is queen of d3. Okay, and we know that the point of this, again, is to play rook to d1 and to do so as fast as possible, and also to play knight to e4 without having to worry about queen to e3 check or queen to h4 check, either picking up the knight or forcing a retreat. All right, so here, black takes the f-pawn, believe it or not. So queen d8, c7, e5, g5, f6, and now after rook to f1, it's time for it to move again. Queen to e5. So it moves, I think, 6 times now, and it's in the center. Maybe it's just 5 times. Let me see. So it's c7, e5, g5. Yeah, okay, 5 times, but it's going to move again. Now here, the most obvious move is to castle long. But surprisingly, this is perhaps not the most accurate move. Why is it not the most accurate move? Why wouldn't we want to bring the rook into play and get our king into safety and unpin the bishop on e2? Well, the funny reason is that it again allows some nasty little checks. So, for example, after rook to a7, it looks like black is just going to be dead after something like knight to f3, because queen c7 is not very, very appealing, and he's got to stop the queen to d8 mate threat. But, okay, actually the funny thing is he plays queen f4 check. And now the point is, okay, if we play king b1, rook to d7, problem solved. Or if knight to d2, well, okay, it stops the check, it uncovers the f-file, but it blocks the c-file, the d-file. So queen c7, bishop h5, g6, queen d4, e5, and all of a sudden black is, the pieces are coming out, it's making some progress. All right, here too it looks like black might be in tough shape, but he has bishop to e7. Now another trick, bishop to b7. And black is okay. So he's still up a pawn. He doesn't have to worry about the dark squares around his king. The rook on a7 is hanging, so he can't take the bishop on h5 yet. But basically he's okay. So another crazy variation, but black is just holding on there by the thread. So after queen to e5, instead of castling, the main move for white is rook to d1. All right, so now again knight f3, and sundry other moves like perhaps knight d takes b5 are in the air. Okay, and just to show again the kinds of disasters that will befall a player with black who's even slightly incautious, we'll take a quick look at a game. Klinger against Vera. Vera's a GM. At that time, he's probably still an IM, but very strong, 2480. But he gets demolished. And he played bishop to b4. So, of course, knight takes e6. Thank you very much. Black can't take anyway, either with the bishop, queen, or pawn, because queen at e8's mate. So even with the pawn, because the rook on f1 takes away f7. So black has to kind of embarrassedly go back to e7. All right, now queen to d5. So if he takes, then knight takes d5 is fine, or probably even better, knight to c7 check, and then knight takes d5. And black has all kinds of problems. So he tried queen takes e6, and then knight to c6. So hoping to buy his way out, but get to a reasonable position. But okay, white just swaps off, brings his queen back out, and queen to e5 is another mistake by Vera, and you have 5 seconds to figure out what's wrong with this move. The answer is queen takes f7 check. So mating very quickly. Well, okay, I guess not, because all right, king h8, queen f8. Yeah, no, that still mates. King h8, queen f8, knight g8, queen takes g8. We just do it again. King g8, rook to d8, queen e8, rook takes e8 mate. And of course, if rook takes f7, rook to d8 check, and then either rook takes on f8 is mate. So black resigned here. 21 move loss. Just shows you gotta be careful in this variation. So after rook to d1, the right move is rook to a7. Okay, so now white can play knight to f3, and there's no check for the black queen, so she's got to go back to c7. All right, now knight to g5, hitting f7, f5, and now a really neat and nasty move from black's point of view, queen to d4. And the idea of this move is to play bishop to h5 check, without allowing, well, okay, g6 can be played, but it'll hang the rook. So black plays sometimes the move h5 here, trying to stop it, and then rook takes f5, e takes, knight to d5, and this leads to very, very sharp play. Actually, this occurred in one of the Tal Poligievsky games in their candidates match in 1979. And I believe that game ended up, I think it was a draw, but super complicated game. All right. I'm not sure if that's the latest word in this variation. I think there have been some important analyses since then. So I think, in fact, Poligievsky himself in a later game played queen to e7 and gave up the exchange, but kept his pawn structure intact here. And this position, too, is quite unclear. I mean, white's up the exchange for a pawn, and his queen seems to be brilliantly placed. But in fact, again, it's not really so clear. I mean, black has a fantastic pawn structure. If the queens came off the board, I think black would even just be better here, and possibly soon to be much, much better. So this is still quite an interesting and difficult position. All right, well, that is all that I wanted to say about the Poligievsky variation. And now it's time to move on to an even, well, I don't know if it's even bigger, but it's another very major system, the poison pawn of queen of e6. Black's idea is to grab the pawn on b2, and it's not just that he's grabbing a pawn, but that in fact it absolutely demolishes white's queenside. Recall that I've mentioned on a number of occasions, both in this show and even in previous shows, that one of black's major ideas in the Najdorf is to play b5, b4, and to do so, to kick the knight on c3, which is well posted, and also, and relatedly, to put pressure on and even win the pawn on e4. Well, okay, by playing queen takes b2, we're doing the same thing as b5, b4, but we're doing it while we're bringing a piece into very active play and absolutely destroying white's queenside structure. I mean, after queen takes b2, white is basically forced to prove sufficient compensation in his attack, or else he's just going to be strategically lost, and also down a pawn. So white has to find some good way of responding to this move. Now, white could play the wimpy knight to b3. This is playable, and we've discussed this before. I mean, this idea of kicking the knight back to b3, and then let's say black plays queen back to c7 at some point, and the net gain seems to be in black's favor. So let's say knight b to d7, queen f3, bishop to e7, castle's long, and now queen to c7, preparing to play b5. And this is actually good for black. I mean, it's not that black is better, but it seems to be an improvement for black over the main line. I mean, the knight on d4 is more aggressively posted, and there's no drawback to it that I can think of offhand. There isn't any variation where it's loose or that it blocks the d file. So the knight on b3, okay, it's a little bit better for defensive purposes, but what you lose from the aggressive point of view outweighs that, it seems. So knight to b3 really is, it's a wimpy move. I mean, it's maybe not bad. I mean, if you know everything else about the bishop to g5 systems, and you're happy with everything else, but you don't like the poison pawn, and you just want to play chess instead of going into a memory contest or an engine contest, then okay, play knight to b3. But it's definitely not the principled approach. Okay, another kind of wuss approach, sorry to put it so bluntly, is a3. And there's a transparent trick here. So here's the quick question. Can black get away with queen takes b2? The answer to this question is that he cannot do so unless he is eager to go and do something else with his afternoon, because knight to a4 just traps the queen. Game over. So after a3, black switches gears. Let's say he plays knight to c6, and this is just perfectly fine for black. So knight to b3, let's say, and then h6 is good, or bishop to e7. They're all fine. No problems whatsoever. Another move that's sometimes played by white is queen to d3. And this can be quite similar to the regular queen to d2 lines. So queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen a3. Here no one plays e5, but f5 instead. Okay, and now, all right, knight to c6, and let's say fe, takes, and okay, bishop to e2, bishop to e7. And there are some similarities to some main lines in the queen to d2 variations. Also, though, instead of knight to c6, bishop to e7 might be even better, or at least more accurate. So bishop to e7, and here knight to c6. Black seems to have done pretty well. Actually, this just transposes? No, not quite. Yeah, so the difference is black is ready to meet bishop takes f6 with bishop takes f6 rather than g takes f6. So that's kind of the finesse. But actually, let me see. Yeah, no, we probably are. Yeah, it just is a transposition. So castles, queen a5. Here we do see maybe one difference. There's no the bishop on g5 is not protected. So takes, and okay, bishop h5 is impossible because of the queens being there. White plays bishop to g4, and all right. I mean, this is just, whoops, castle's not rook to g8, and this is just its own kind of messy variation. So I don't really know this line as well. It's less popular, and for that reason, I mean, you can use it as a surprise weapon. So I would say, you know, if you're going to play this with either side, obviously do some more research. But it could be useful as a surprise tool. Theoretically speaking, though, it's not considered as dangerous as queen to d2. So let's have a look at queen to d2. Now here, sometimes, just as white sometimes wusses out with knight to b3, well, after queen to d2, sometimes black kind of counter wusses with knight to c6. So it's like they're both bluffing, you know, to see, okay, are you going to sack the pawn? Yeah, I'm going to sack the pawn. Are you going to take the pawn? Well, maybe not. So after knight to c6, white usually just castles. And, okay, black can play bishop to d7, knight to b3, and we're in kind of a classical. Now here, knight to b3 isn't so bad because black is kind of slightly misplaced his own queenside pieces. But usually when black goes for this, it goes into this ending. And it seems that with knight to a4, maybe white has an edge, or at least reasonable chances to get an edge. Certainly, black isn't going to get the kind of fun and dynamic possibilities that he does get in the regular accepted version of the poison pawn. So let's take a look at that. Queen takes b2. Now here, the main move is rook to b1, but knight to b3 had its trendy moment when Spassky played this against Fischer a couple of times in their 72 match. Now, black can play queen to a3, and this is, I think, the most common move, just getting the queen out. And, you know, again, black is okay. I mean, this line it has its dangers. I mean, again, if you play this, you should know something, but it's not really considered to be that threatening. In fact, queen to a3 is so knight to b3 is so unthreatening that black can even get away with knight to c6. Now, this might look like a blunder at first because white has the move a3. So see if you can figure out why black is okay here. Another little puzzle for you. So stop the recording and put your noodle to work, your noggin to work, your mind, I should say, and see what you can find. Well, the answer is this. Okay, the queen is in big danger due to the threat of rook to a2, but for the moment at least, white's setup is a bit flimsy. So the rook is protected by the knight, and so we can play knight to a5. Nasty little trick there. So, and if rook to a2, no problem. Play knight takes b3, hitting the queen. If the queen moves, there's queen to c1 or queens, you know, all kinds of things could be possible. And on cb, of course, well, we just happily trade queens. We're up a pawn for basically nothing. So, a3 is a mistake. All right, so anyway, knight to b3 is not really considered to be such a big deal. Actually, let me see if I missed something even better. Don't think I did, but maybe I did. I'm trying to think if knight takes e4 is good here. No, I don't believe so. Yeah, so knight takes, pawn takes, and knight e4 tricks don't work here either. Okay. Yeah, I was just seeing if I was maybe shortchanging white a bit, or black a bit. Okay, so anyway, knight to b3, no big deal. So rook to b1 is the main move, overwhelmingly. Queen to a3. And now here white has no less than 4 moves. So the more positional approaches, which were popular for a while in the early 80s when the more direct approaches with f5 and e5 seem to have fizzled out. So the more slow positional approaches, only somewhat slower, are bishop to e2, and then bishop takes f6 followed by bishop to e2. So let's take a quick look. All right, so on bishop to e2, one idea is that if black follows suit, plays bishop to e7 and tries to just castle quickly, say castles, and now, okay, actually knight b to d7 to stop e5 before castling. Well, here white has a very nice sequence that leads to a very, very powerful attack. So e5, takes, knight takes, why not? So now we take here, and whether black plays g takes f6 or bishop f6, whenever black ends up with a pawn on f6, white's going to respond with knight to e4. So in other words, if g takes f6, then knight to e4, and white has a fantastic score in this position, like 90+%. And if bishop takes f6, oops, let me put in a little symbol here, at least for my own use. Okay, so if bishop takes f6, rook f6, and knight e4. And again, white has done very well here, and the theoretical evaluation of this position is that it's favorable for white. Okay, so after bishop to e2, it seems to be better to play like this. Knight b to d7, and then on castles, not bishop to e7, which would just transpose, but queen to c5. And the point of this is not just to create this pin on the a7 g1 diagonal, but also to take e5 under control. So that way, e5 from white, that pawn sack isn't going to be as meaningful as it was in the other variation. So king h1, now bishop to e7, and here white tries to switch gears with f5. Okay, so e5, knight e6, very interesting. Takes, and then here black could castle and just kind of, again, wimp out, give back the piece, but it's best for him to play the principled move, knight to b6. And there's a bit of analysis here. I mean, this has been played quite a few times, but it seems that black is better here. How much better, I'm not sure, but looks like white probably does not have full compensation. And note that bishop to e3 doesn't regain the piece because of knight to c4. Okay, so that isn't an easy way out for white at all. All right, so that was a quick look at bishop to e2. Now, bishop takes f6. How about this one? Well, g takes f6, bishop e2, and now h5. And here it becomes, well, black's pawn structure is pretty much like a Rouser Sicilian. In other words, the classical Sicilian, that's the variation, where black plays knight to c6 instead of a6, and white plays bishop to g5. So the classical is knight c6 on move 5 for black. The Rouser is once white plays bishop to g5, is what you've got there. So this is a very similar structure. The difference is, of course, that white is a little bit more ahead in development, and black is, of course, up a pawn. So possible way that this can continue: castles, knight to d7, king h1, bishop e7, rook f3, queen a5, and h4. And okay, I mean, it's just a difficult position, but black seems to be a little bit better. At least that's the traditional theoretical evaluation that's been given about this position. But of course, both sides still have problems to solve. Black has to figure out how does he complete his development without allowing something bad. I mean, he can't play b5 because the knight to c6. F5 is going to come at some point, and okay, what does he do to keep his king safe in the long run? So that's the battle. All right. At any rate, from a theoretical standpoint, at least, black is okay there. And so let's look at the main moves, f5 and e5. Now, e5 was popular originally. I mean, it's very direct. It blasts open lots of lines. And it's kind of like the Polygievsky again. I mean, black has been moving his queen around and around, not really developing very much. And so it looks like white just wants to crash through in the center as fast as possible and behead the black king. Well, sometimes it works, but in the 50s and 60s, especially thanks to people like Fischer, not only him though, but he made a very big contribution. E5 kind of fell out of favor, and then f5 became the main move. So let's look at contemporary theory with f5. So knight c6, fe, takes, e5, takes, and knight to e4. And this has happened hundreds of times, and at all levels as well. And there are just countless variations where this leads to perpetual check. So I'm just going to give one fairly recent version of the perpetual check draw that occurred in a couple of Kasparov games from 2004. So queen takes a2. Bishop d7 has been played as well. Rook to d1, threatening queen to d8. So bishop to e7, bishop e2, threatening to play bishop to h5 check. So black castles. White does the same. And now white's hope is to play something like this. Queen h6, rook f3, rook g3, and crush and maim and destroy. So black has to play quite actively and hurry up with his counterplay. So rook to a7, rook f3, king h8, rook to g3, rook to d7, queen h6. And at first sight, it looks like black is going to fall apart here. So rook to f7. But there are always these really annoying tactical tricks that black has to stay alive here. So queen h5 is the main move that's been played here. And now if rook to f8, for instance, queen to g4 is probably winning. Or rook takes d7 and then queen to g4. So just to show you that. Okay, so let's say he goes back. Take, queen g4. And good luck stopping both mate threats. Can't be done. So that's the kind of thing that black has to be very aware of. But he survives. Takes, and now a remarkable defensive sequence. Queen to a5. Okay, so the first point is a pretty brutal one. If queen takes f7, queen to e1 mate means that black comes in first. Okay, so king to f1 covers it. Well, what does black do now? Still, if he moves his rook back to f8, queen g4, still game over. So what does black do? So see if you can figure it out this time. Well, the answer is this. Queen to d8. And, okay, now if white protects the bishop on d1, or let's say moves it, when I say protect, I mean protecting it with something else so that way he can play queen takes f7, then black has time to play rook to g7 without worrying about queen to e8 check. Or he could play queen to f8 or a bunch of other things. So takes, king f2, queen c2, king e3, bishop c5 check. And in a game between a player named Azarov and Kasparov in Izmir in 2004, they agreed to a draw here. I don't remember which game was first and which one was last. They were both played in 2004. But Vallejo Pons, in another game with Kasparov, also that year, went a few more moves. So knight c5, queen c5, king d2, queen f2, queen d4, queen f3, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so draw agreed here. So that's the problem with this line and with the poison pawn in general, for both sides really, is that there are an awful lot of perpetual check draws. I mean, you can't play this with black if you're not willing to draw, because white can just play into these f5 variations. And as far as I know, I mean, there's just nothing you can do that's reasonable to avoid this. I mean, either you're just going to be clearly worse, or you have to allow white to give perpetual. So it's an okay line to play if you're playing a peer or someone higher rated and you're in a situation where a draw is fine. But if you're playing a lower rated player, I mean, it's Russian roulette, or at least half-point Russian roulette, because if the guy just memorizes a few things and is reasonably competent, if you vary, then the best you're going to get is a draw. Okay. On the other hand, f5 doesn't seem to be anything more for white than a draw either, and this is really the main reason why bishop to g5 went out of business in the mid-80s. Just people, e5 had been done, the positional tries with bishop to e2 and bishop takes f6 weren't working, and f5 was just, 2,000 different perpetual check variations. Well, finally, in the, just a couple of years ago, really, 3 years ago, I guess now, Radjabov managed to bring e5 back into prominence. So he's played this a bunch of times, and now it's becoming a really hot and trendy line again. So let's look a little bit at, it's time is actually kind of ticking away here. So we've gone pretty close to an hour. So I think probably at this point it's best if we postpone e5 as well for the next session. So this may still drag into at least a couple more shows. So I hope you guys like the Najdorf. If you don't like the Najdorf, this is This is going to be excruciating for you. But then again, we're getting into enough detail that it's no longer really the super fast Najdorf. It's becoming the relatively detailed poison pawn and mainline bishop to g5 line. So anyway, I hope you're enjoying this. It's fun for me. I mean, these are variations that I grew up studying. Well, of course, not the stuff that Radjabov has come up with recently, but in general, the bishop to g5 Najdorf was very popular when I was a kid, and just always really exciting and a lot of fun. So certainly entertaining to me. Hope you're enjoying it too. And we'll return to e5, and depending on how fast that goes, to the main lines, or the main lines, after bishop to g5, e6, f4. And those lines are bishop to e7. So go ahead and enter it here. Knight b to d7, and queen to c7. And all of these can transpose, but they have their important finesses, their important little differences, and we'll take a look at them at some point. Who knows how long, but how long from now. But it won't be more than, if it's not next show, it'll certainly be the Najdorf show after that. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.